This blind dog was abandoned by a cowardly owner, mistreated and starved on the street, until a couple decided to adopt him. But what happened next broke his heart, because this dog had a dark secret that would change the lives of this couple, and even that cowardly owner him. Have you ever wondered what to a heart that has never been loved? What remains of a being who has never known the warmth of a gentle touch, of a soft word, or the security of a look that says, "You matter"? This is the story of Apollo, a dog who not only lost his sight, but also his Apollo was not a hero, a symbol of overcoming or an example of resilience. He was, quite simply, a survivor. A thin, fragile body dragged the unforgiving streets of Mexico City, sustained by a primal instinct that, for some cruel reason, refused to let him give up. Existence was an empty echo, a silent scream suffocated by the noise of indifference, of a world that seemed to have forgotten he was there. His fur, perhaps soft and full of life, had turned into a tangled cloak of dirt, mud, and dried blood. The hair was stuck to scabs from open wounds. The result, countless falls, bites from other hungry dogs, and human neglect. The smell of infection mixed with the dry sweat of the thin skin was so that it drove away even other stray animals. He was a shadow of himself, or he had never been anything but a shadow. But what hurt most wasn't visible. The real abyss was in his eyes, or, better, in the void where the shine of life should be. His eyes were cloudy, opaque like fogged glass. He was blind, not from birth, but from neglect. An illness that was never treated, maybe an injury caused by someone who once saw him and decided he deserved nothing but pain. The fact is that had lost the ability to see the world, but the world had been lost to him long before that, and the world, cruel in its haste and passed him by every day. People in a hurry looked away, not out of malice, but because facing Apollo was facing in truth. That pain exists, even when we pretend it doesn't. Some children pointed, curious, but were pulled by arms by adults who whispered, "Don't look at it." Because Apollo had turned that a thing, a rag of life that looked more like a of bones than a living being. He didn't ask for help, not because he didn't need it, but because he had learned cruelest way that asking was no use. At some point, lost in a past that perhaps he himself did not remember clearly, Apollo shouted. He screamed with all the strength a desperate heart could muster. He barked not that alert or playful bark, but a deep bark, full of hunger and loneliness. He cried, a muffled, hoarse cry that didn't just come from his throat but from a deeper place, from a soul that to accept that the world could be so indifferent, and no one listened, or worse, they heard it and didn't care. The sound of his pain, the air, and reached the ears of someone, perhaps many, but it wasn't enough, it wasn't enough. He was just another one, just a noise in the background of the hurried routine of any given day. Maybe someone even glanced over, sighed in mock lament, and moved on, themselves with the silent lie that they couldn't do anything. And thus, Apollo understood a lesson that should never have been taught to anyone. Suffering does not make enough noise to stop the world, so he stopped trying. Scream gave way to a sigh. The barking stopped. The crying dried up. The silence, oh, the silence, that became his only friend. A faithful who didn't judge him, didn't ignore him, didn't rush past pretending not to see. The silence was constant, present. Cozy in its own, he didn't promise anything. It offered nothing, but it didn't disappoint either. It was just there, next to him. As he wandered, a figure in the shadows, a heart beating by inertia and not by will. And the most painful thing is that, even at the bottom of that, without sound, without color, without heat, Apollo still felt it. I felt the emptiness. I felt the cold of indifference than the cold of the night. I felt the invisible weight of existing without being seen. And that, more than hunger, than open wounds, was what really hurt. Because there is no greater pain than being invisible to the world while you scream inside, begging to exist. Body was a map of pain. The protruding ribs felt like blades beneath the thin, taut skin. His paws, injured and swollen, could barely support him, but continued walking because to stop would be to accept the end. And ironically, Apollo seemed to be more afraid of the end than of the pain. Hunger was a constant presence, a black hole that sucked away his energy, his dignity. The empty stomach hurt, but the emptiness in the chest hurt more. Sometimes he lay on dirty sidewalks, shivering from the cold and exhaustion. In moments he would shrink away, trying to disappear, as if he could hide from the world that rejected him. His nights were long and cruel, exposed the rain, the biting cold, and the constant fear of being attacked by other animals or worse, people, because Apollo knew somehow that could be crueler than hunger. But what is most moving about this story is not Apollo's suffering. What breaks his heart is the fact that despite there was a spark inside him, a light so small it could barely be seen, but it was there. The survival, perhaps. But deep down it was something more. It was the dormant hope that in some corner of the world there could be a different look that didn't see him as trash, but as life. Apollo didn't know this, but every painful step he took brought him to that look. Fate, silent and patient, was plotting something for him, because sometimes, even in the moment, there is a light waiting to be turned on, and even though Apollo couldn't see it, he was about to feel it. And it is in this, between the cruelest abandonment and the most unexpected hope, that the true beauty of this story begins. Because Apollo's heart, broken into 1,000 pieces, still beat, and that in itself was already a miracle. Have you ever felt that a simple attitude can completely change destiny of a puppy that sometimes just needs love and affection? Comment hope his sank when he imagined what Apollo faced. Like the video and subscribe to the channel so that more people can discover stories that the power of connection and new beginnings. Have you ever wondered what happens to the memories of someone who has been forgotten? Do they disappear with time, or do they remain there, hidden in some corner of mind, like echoes of a life that could have been different? The past of Apollo, it was exactly that, a void filled with of pain and silences that screamed louder than any happy memory. Nobody knew what had to him. There was no name engraved on a collar, no clues that told his story. What remained were the marks on his body and the embedded in his soul. Perhaps Apollo had been a family dog, perhaps a happy puppy, with a curious and a restless tale. Maybe he knew the warmth of a home, the comfort of a soft bed, and the sound of the laughter of a child who once him a friend. But if this really happened, everything was swallowed by leaving behind only what should never have existed: abandonment. Apollo's abandonment did not seem like something that suddenly. It wasn't a simple story of a lost dog who couldn't find his way back home. The scars across his body told an older and more painful story. Old marks, some already covered by hair, others still visible as silent witnesses of and neglect. They were scars that time could not erase because they were not just physical, they were to the soul. There was a look in Apollo that carried the of someone who has waited too long. The kind of look that doesn't look for more, that doesn't ask. That wait. He seemed to have accepted that the world had forgotten him, and somehow he also began to forget himself. Abandonment was not a specific for him. It was a slow process, a silent erosion of what might once have been hope. Maybe he was left on a random road, a car door closing behind him, and the sound of the engine moving away, taking away everything he knew. Or perhaps he was ignored within his own home, animal that became a burden, invisible within the walls that were once his home. Abandonment is not always a violent act. Sometimes it is made up of that no longer meet, hands that no longer touch, doors that close without a goodbye. Apollo carried this in every hesitant step, in tired sigh. The world had forgotten him, and he seemed to have accepted it, not by choice but because at some point he learned that waiting more than conforming. It was easier to believe that no one else was coming than to feel the disappointment of waiting for who would never return. But even so, something inside him still existed, a small spark, almost, but that prevented him from simply giving up. Maybe it was just the survival instinct, or maybe it was something more, an old memory, lost in corner of the heart, of when he was still seen, still loved. Because no matter how much abandonment tries to erase everything, some things, the smell of a hug, the warmth of a lap, the sound of the voice of someone who once whispered your name with affection. Apollo's past was enigma, but his present screamed a painful truth. He didn't need to remember everything to miss what he lost. The body could have, but the heart never forgets what it is to be loved. And even if he didn't know it, fate was about to remind him of, because abandonment may have erased part of your story. But love, true love, always finds a way to rewrite the have you ever had that strange feeling that something or someone crossed your path for a reason greater than chance? Sometimes it's a quick encounter, a brief look, but one that seems to silently shout, "Look at me, I need you." That's how it happened with Mateo and Camila on that cloudy morning in Mexico City. The sky was gray. A cold breeze blew through the deserted streets, and the world seemed as apathetic as the empty gaze of those who rush past, without realizing what matters around them. Mateo and Camila were a simple couple, those who found more love in everyday life than in grand gestures. Walked hand in hand, exchanging low words and light smiles, until Camila stopped abruptly. There was nothing special about the landscape, just a few trash cans and the distant sound of traffic. But there, among torn garbage bags and remains, there was something that broke the rhythm of that ordinary day. A fragile, almost imperceptible shadow, lying on side, motionless. At first glance, it looked like a pile of abandoned rags. The body was so thin, so still, That for a brief moment, Camilla, it was just accumulated trash, but something, perhaps a silent instinct, a whispering inner voice, made her come closer. Then she saw it. It wasn't a pile of rags, was Apollo. He was lying in an awkward position, his body rigid, his thin paws bent uncomfortably, his nose against the cold floor. The eyes, opaque and empty, were half open, fixed on nothing. It was the look of someone who had already given up. Chest rose and fell so slowly that Camilla thought for a distressing second that he wasn't breathing. But then, almost in silent response, a slight ran through his dirty tail, an almost invisible movement, but one that carried the weight of something greater. Life. Camilla instinctively down, ignoring the dirty floor. Her heart sank in a way she couldn't explain. The dog was in a deplorable state, covered in dirt, wounds and signs of cruel abandonment. But there was something there, something that cut through her devastated appearance and spoke directly to her. It was as if Apollo, even without the strength to bark or cry, was asking, "Don't pass me by either." Matteo hesitated for a moment, looking around as if waiting for someone else to take on that responsibility. There was no one, just the uncomfortable silence of a big city where stories of pain are lost among horns and hurried footsteps. And in that instant, understood. They were Apollo's last thread of hope. Without exchanging many words, Matteo took off his coat and carefully spread it over the dog's body. The touch made Apollo shiver slightly, not from pain, but from surprise. Perhaps was the first act of kindness he had felt in a long time. They wrapped the coat around him, feeling how cold he was, a cold that seemed to from within, from the soul. The ride home was silent. Apollo didn't make a sound, didn't show resistance. It was as if he was to his fate, whatever it was. His dull eyes remained fixed somewhere in the distance. But there was a subtle hint of change. The of abandonment was beginning to share space with something new and strange to him, a thin thread of hope. They arrived home. Camilla prepared a warm corner with blankets while Matteo brought water and some food. Apollo did not react immediately. He lay motionless, his eyes blank as if he didn't understand what was happening. But when Camilla gently touched his head, something broke inside him. Wasn't a bark nor a cry. It was a sigh, a deep pain sigh, as if he was releasing years of accumulated suffering. Have you ever thought about how body can fight for life while the soul has already given up? Sometimes the hardest battle is not against hunger, pain, illness, but against the silent emptiness that sets in when hope fades. To Apollo, that was the real fight. His fragile body, covered in scars, marks from a cruel past, still breathed, but his heart seemed to just carry out a mechanical routine, without purpose, without will, was alive, but not lived. The first days after the rescue were a raw portrait of Apollo's fragility. The very thin body, with protruding ribs, looked like a skeleton covered in thin, dirty skin. The paws were stiff, the muscles atrophied from lack of movement and accumulated trauma. He could stand up. Each breath was an effort, a whisper of resistance amidst the silence of someone who no longer expected anything from life. The empty and distant did not react even to the soft sound of his voice, Camilla, or the gentle touch of Matteo. Apollo refused food. It wasn't just weakness, though his body was reduced to bones covered in thin, scarred skin. It wasn't just an empty stomach that screamed for, but something deeper, an emptiness in the soul so devastating it seemed stronger than hunger itself. Was as if he believed deep down in what was left of his existence that he didn't deserve to live. The food was there in front of him, but he didn't any food. I saw an echo of a past in which asking for anything meant being ignored, punished, or rejected. The hunger was there, burning like an open wound that never healed. But there was something even more painful, the invisible pain, the one that cannot be seen in exams or with medication. The emotional pain of abandonment, of loneliness embedded in each weak heartbeat, of being a burden that the world preferred to forget. He did not reject food because of lack of appetite. He rejected it because, somewhere he had already accepted that it wasn't worth continuing. It was as if feeding was an act of hope, and Apollo no longer knew what that. He trembled at the slightest touch, not because of the cold, although the night's ice had left his joints stiff sore. The cruelest cold did not come from outside, but from within. Fear was ingrained in every of his being, as if it had been engraved there, not with words, but with absence, abandonment, and perhaps violence. Time a hand approached. His body shrank, instinctively waiting for the impact of a blow that, even though it didn't come, was already registered in memory. Human touch, which was supposed to bring comfort, warmth, and security, was a reminder that hands can hurt more than can heal. Stroking for Apollo did not mean affection. It meant danger, because before finding Camilla, and the hands that reached out to him did not welcome him, They pushed, hit, ignored. It was as if every gentle gesture now a trap, and he was always waiting for the moment when the gentle touch would turn into pain. The rejection of the fear of touch, the blank stare, none of this was just about the present. It was a reflection of a past that he carried in every tremor, in every heavy sigh. Apollo's body was starving, but his soul was in an even more cruel of hunger. Hunger for security, for belonging, for being seen not as a burden but as someone who matters. And was the real struggle, not against malnutrition but against the silent belief that he wasn't worth saving. Because abandonment doesn't just leave starving for food, he leaves heart starving for love. And this hunger, Apollo still didn't know how to. Camilla, with a more resilient heart than she imagined, spent nights by his side. She didn't need to say much. Her were soft whispers filled with a tenderness that Apollo didn't understand, but was beginning to feel. She spoke as he could respond, telling simple stories, talking about the day, the weather, life. Words that didn't ask for anything in return. They offered company. She believed that somehow, even if he didn't react, his soul heard. Matteo was different, more restrained, but with a patience few would have. He didn't know exactly how to help, but he was there. He brought fresh water, tried to feed Apollo in small, left his hand outstretched for long minutes, allowing the dog to get used to his presence. No grand gestures, just, and sometimes that's what saves. Someone who doesn't give up even when everything seems lost. There were moments when it seemed like Apollo was the body became colder, breathing became irregular. Camilla held her fragile paws and whispered, "With me, Apollo, you are not alone." Maybe he understood. Maybe it was just the sound of her voice that hymned there. But in every weak sigh there was an invisible decision to continue. Even without knowing, time passed slowly, almost cruelly. Small progress turned into gigantic victories. The first day he accepted a spoonful of wet was a milestone. It wasn't easy. He hesitated, turned his face away, but Camilla insisted with infinite. When he finally gave in and licked some of the food, his eyes, opaque and sightless, seemed less distant. For a brief it was as if for a second Apollo felt something other than pain. The other day, while was making Apollo's makeshift bed, the puppy moved his tail slightly. It was not a joyful tremor, but a subtle, almost imperceptible movement. Anyone, it could go unnoticed, but for those watching with their hearts it was a silent explosion of hope. It was proof that, even though he was hurt and out, Apollo still had a spark of life. The recovery process was not linear. There were days when he seemed to get better, then suddenly everything regressed. Unexpected fevers, relapses. Moments when he cowered in a corner, shaking in fear of nothing. In these moments, Camilla and Matteo looked at each other, feeling the weight of, but they never gave up. There was one night in particular that marked this phase. Apollo had a crisis. His weak body trembled and he seemed unable to breathe properly. Camilla held him in her arms, feeling her despair growing. She cried, tears falling as she whispered, "You're not leaving, not now, not after all." She knew that Apollo might not understand the words, but perhaps he felt emotion, and somehow he felt it. After long minutes of anguish, his breathing stabilized. It wasn't a miracle. It was her, the warmth of her embrace, the sound of her voice that said, "You matter." For the first time, perhaps, Apollo believed this a little. As weeks went by, signs of improvement began to emerge, albeit timidly. He began to stand up on his own, even if he was staggering. The fear of touch. He allowed Camilla to stroke his head, closing his eyes, not out of fear, but out of comfort. Matteo patiently managed to get Apollo accept water directly from his hands. Apollo's gaze was still blind, but not empty. There was something new, a spark. It wasn't happiness, not yet, but it was the start of something. Maybe confidence. Perhaps a recognition that he was not just made of pain. Apollo's body had been fighting since the first day, but his soul, it only started to when it realized that there was someone fighting for it too. Because at the end of the day, what keeps us alive is not just the in our lungs or the blood flowing through our veins. It's the feeling that we are not alone. And Apollo wasn't no more. Have you ever stopped to think about the power that exists in a simple gesture? Something so small, so subtle, that it go unnoticed, but that carries the weight of a silent decision. I want to try again. To Apollo, this gesture was standing up. Yes. Just after days in which time seemed to drag along with pain, one morning brought not only sunlight filtering through the window, but also the first point in the life of a dog who had forgotten what it was like to hope. The day started like any other. The air was still. The sound of the city echoed softly, and Camilla, with his routine marked by concern, opened the door to the room where Apollo was resting. She to find the same thing as always. The thin body curled up in a corner, the opaque eyes staring into space, and that stillness that weighed more any silence. But as she opened the door, she stopped. The heart accelerated. In front of him was Apollo, standing. He wasn't steady. Its paws trembled, thin as dry twigs, struggling to support its own weight. The body still too fragile for the simple act of remaining upright. But he was there, defying everything that had kept him grounded in the last few. The pain, the fear, the abandonment. His blind gaze was fixed on nothing. But there was subtle movement of his head, as if he were trying to find something familiar, and he found it. The sound of Camilla's voice. She didn't notice when the whisper escaped her lips. Apollo? It was enough. He turned his head slightly, as if that sound was an invisible rope him back from the dark place where he had hidden. And then something even more unexpected happened. Apollo took step, a hesitant, insecure step, but full of meaning. The ground seemed too far away for trembling paws, but he tried anyway. And in that instant, the impossible began to seem possible. Camilla felt it in her throat. It was just one step, but to her it felt like an entire marathon. Her eyes filled with tears, not with sadness, but with new, something she no longer knew if she was capable of feeling, hope. Apollo couldn't see, but he seemed to feel her presence in a way that beyond vision. It was as if his heart, after so long in silence, was beginning to remember what it liked to connect with someone. This moment was small, but it carried a big message. Apollo was trying. After days or years of living as if he were just an empty body, something inside him had decided to fight. There was no logical explanation for this. It was the soft sound of Camilla's voice, the familiar smell of the house, the warmth he felt when she touched him so carefully. Maybe it was just a spark lost in the darkness, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that, against all expectations, he was standing. Pateo soon after, finding Camilla kneeling on the floor with her hands outstretched to Apollo and tears running down her face. When he saw the dog, he froze. I didn't say anything. He just approached slowly, as if afraid of breaking that fragile moment. Apollo felt his presence. He turned his head, sniffing the air, trying to understand what was happening, and suddenly he took another step. Small, but one step. This was how the first thread of hope intertwined with Apollo's heart. It wasn't a sudden miracle. It was a silent battle against that had held him down. Abandonment, pain, fear. And he won. Not because he stood up, but because who stand up? Because tried. In the days that followed, this small progress turned into a series of quiet victories. Apollo began to move more, even if slowly. He trembled at the slightest unfamiliar sound, but he no longer flinched as much when he felt Camilla and Mateo's touch. He began to recognize voices, routines, and with each hesitant step, the empty space inside him seemed to shrink a little. Camilla and Mateo never underestimated the importance of first moment. They knew that Apollo wasn't just learning to walk again. He was learning to each step was a choice, trusting that the ground would be there to support him, that the approaching hands would not hurt him. That voice that called him would not disappear like so many others before. And that was the real twist. Not the fact that Apollo was standing, but that he wanted to be. The body was still fighting, but now the soul was fighting too. He was no longer just surviving. I was beginning, slowly, silently, to live. Sometimes we think that great moments define a life, but for Apollo, one step was enough. A simple gesture, but loaded with powerful message. I'm still here. And that was enough to change everything. Have you ever thought about how life can change in almost imperceptible moments? Sometimes it's not a big event that transforms everything, but a step, a sigh, an instant when something inside us awakens, even if the world around us seems the same. To Apollo, the fresh start didn't happen at once. It was built in silence, in the delicate rhythm of someone who had lost everything, but still carried, well, a spark of hope. Time passed slowly after the rescue. The first few days were a mixture of fear and strangeness. Apollo still carried deep, which could not be washed away with a bath or cured with medicine. The scars on his body were just the surface. The real was in the quietest corners of his soul. The sound of footsteps down the hall still made his perk up in alert. Any sudden movement was a reminder of what he had experienced, as if the past always lurking, waiting to drag him back. But Camilla and Mateo were there day after day, with a patience that seemed infinite. They forced, they didn't pressure, just they were. And for a hurting heart, that silent presence is what matters most. Over time, Apollo began to that those soft voices and those careful hands were different. They didn't come to hurt, but to comfort. The sound of footsteps that to cause fear was now familiar, and the smell of Camilla and Mateo became a sign of safety. He started moving more. First, movements inside the house, guided by scent and sounds. The sound of water running in the sink, the sound of leaves rustling outside, the smell of coffee, all of it was new to him but somehow comforting. Apollo learned to explore the world with the courage of someone who has already the worst. After all, what could be scarier than abandonment? And he it. The emptiness in Apollo's eyes seemed less profound. Although he never regained his sight, there was something different in his gaze. A glow not from those who see the world with their eyes, but from those who begin to feel it with their hearts. Camilla used to say that Apollo didn't to see to understand love. He just felt it. Then the day of the park arrived. For any other dog, it would just be walk. For Apollo, it was a milestone. First outdoor walk since rescue. The sun was soft. The breeze carried the fresh smell of grass. The distant sound of children playing created a light melody, almost as if the world was in harmony with special moment. Camilla attached Apollo's collar with care that went beyond the physical gesture. It was a ritual, an emotional preparation for something they expected, but didn't know how he would react. Matteo smiled, trying to hide his anxiety. Knew how much that day meant. For Apollo, it was more than leaving home. It was crossing the invisible border between fear and trust. Apollo walked guided by the collar, but also by the invisible bond that had formed between him and his rescuers. The grass floor beneath his paws was new sensation, a texture he explored with each cautious step, the smell of damp earth, the sound of leaves being stepped on. Every detail was absorbed by him with an intensity that only those who have lost everything can feel. And then changed. Have you ever had that strange feeling that something is wrong even though you don't know exactly what it is? That restlessness tightens your chest, makes the air seem heavier and time slow down, as if the world itself were whispering that something is about to happen. That's exactly how Camilla and Matteo felt that day, when Apollo, calm until then, froze in the middle of the park, as if the universe around him had stopped. The sun was still shining softly, the breeze was blowing through the trees, and the distant sound of children's laughter mingled with the chirping of some birds. It seemed like a day, the kind of day when nothing extraordinary should happen, but suddenly Apollo stopped. The body stiffened in a way that Camilla never seen before. His paws were firmly on the ground, his posture tense, his ears completely raised. Even he couldn't see what was in front of him. Camilla felt a shiver run up her spine. It was as if the air around them had changed, becoming denser. Apollo tugged on the leash with a strength they never imagined he had. It was a blind, fragile dog, with a body still recovering from the traumas of past. But at that moment, he seemed guided by something that went beyond physical strength, something primal. He started barking. It was no ordinary bark. It wasn't a request for attention or any warning. It was a desperate sound, filled with urgency that made Matteo's heart race. It was a bark that seemed to shout, "Follow me now!" Matteo and Camilla looked at each other. They're full of unanswered questions. What was Apollo feeling? What did he know that they didn't? They had never seen him like this. Apollo, who used to quiet, fearful, now tugged at the leash with a determination that made no sense for a puppy he couldn't see. Camilla released the leash. The fear of losing him fought with the fear of ignoring what he was trying to show. As soon as he was free, Apollo took off, guided by something to human eyes. Matteo and Camilla ran after him, the sound of barking echoing through the park, piercing the air like a warning. The he followed seemed random, but there was a precision to his movements. He avoided obstacles with surprising skill, as if he knew exactly where rock, every tree, every curve was. The smell, the sound, perhaps something beyond that guided him. There was an urgency in body, a desperation that couldn't be ignored. They ran for minutes that felt like hours, their hearts pounding, not just but from the feeling that something was about to happen. The park, once full of life, felt strange now, as if the world had been holding breath, waiting for the next moment. Then Apollo stopped again, the rigid body, the snout raised, sniffing the air intensity. The silence around was almost deafening. Camilla and Matteo approached, panting, their eyes searching for something. That could explain the dog's behavior. That's when they heard a faint, almost imperceptible sound, a muffled cry, a faint, almost imperceptible sound between the rustling of the leaves and the hurried sound of everyone's breathing. A muffled cry, weak, painful, the sound of someone who had already given up hope of being found. Camilla felt her heart sink and, instinctively, she ran to the bush, pushing aside leaves with her hands shaking. And there she was, a little girl of approximately 4 years old, curled up, her knees pressed to her, shivering with cold and fear. Her face was dirty, stained with dried tears. Her wide eyes reflected the panic of someone who knew where she was, or if anyone would come to find her. Her hair was tangled, and her small hands tightly gripping a dirty teddy bear, as if that piece of cloth was the last anchor, keeping her connected to something safe. Camilla knelt down, her voice choked but soft. "It's okay, sweetie, you're safe now." But the girl, scared, retreated even further, trying to hide in small space where she was. She didn't seem to trust strangers. The fear in her eyes was deeper than the simple fright of being lost. It was then that Apollo approached. Slowly, with careful steps, the body still trembling from the run and the emotion. He sniffed the air, moving his gently, as if he could sense her fear. There was no hurry in his movements, no sudden gestures, just a calm, silent presence that said more any words could express. Apollo, that dog who knew the pain of loneliness better than anyone, knew exactly what to do. Slowly lay down next to the bush, head down, not trying to get too close, just stayed there, present, and that was what broke the barrier. The little slowly stopped crying. The frightened gaze found Apollo's serene body. She reached out a shaky little hand, and for the first time in maybe longer, she breathed a small sigh of relief. His fingers touched the dog's rough, dirty fur, and in that instant, changed. It wasn't Camilla's words nor Matteo's protective presence, it was Apollo. A blind, broken, abandoned dog. And now, the silent hero of a child. Matteo took out his cell phone with shaking hands and called the emergency services, while Camilla, with tears in her eyes, the girl in her coat to protect her from the cold, she repeated words of comfort, but she knew that the real comfort came from the presence of Apollo, remained there motionless, allowing the little girl to find in him an anchor to return to safety. Minutes later, rescuers arrived. The commotion was, the girl had disappeared hours ago and searches were ongoing without success. No one knew where to start. No one except Apollo. The little girl was being attended to. Camilla knelt beside Apollo, cupping his face in her hands, tears flowing uncontrollably. She whispered, "You are life today." Apollo didn't understand the words, but he felt the weight of the emotion. Perhaps he knew on some level that he'd done something extraordinary. Or maybe it didn't matter, because for him it wasn't about being a hero. It was about feeling the invisible of someone who needed to be found. And perhaps by saving that girl, Apollo also saved the part of him that still that life had value. Because in the end, it wasn't just a lost child he found in that park. He found a of himself, the piece that never ceased to exist even when the world tried to erase it. Have you ever wondered if the past is really you? Or does it somehow always find a way to reach us, even when we think we've buried it in a forgotten of memory? That was exactly what Andrew discovered the moment his eyes met Apollo. The park, which before had been the scene of a desperate race and an emotional rescue, was now enveloped in an eerie, heavy silence. The cry of Sophia had replaced by tired sighs of relief as she rested in her mother's arms, who came running in, collapsing on her knees beside her. The hug between the two felt like a patch for a heart broken with fear. But it wasn't at this reunion that the real happened. It was the next moment when Andres, Sophia's father, arrived. His face was marked by the despair a man who thought he had lost what he loved most. He ran to his daughter, holding her so tightly that he seemed she would disappear again. But amidst the whirlwind of emotions, something made his eyes stray, and, for a time, stopped. Andres's gaze found Apollo. It was a second, maybe less, but the impact was profound. Andres's face froze, the relief mixed with else. Shock, disbelief, a fear different from the one he felt when looking for his daughter. It was the kind of fear that comes the past catches up with you, without warning. His gaze remained fixed on Apollo, and his body stiffened as if a memory had exploded into his mind. Camilla noticed the change immediately. The man who, until a second ago, had been was now motionless, staring at Apollo with an intensity that made no sense. She approached slowly, her heart still racing from the rescue, now also carried by a new sensation, curiosity mixed with an inexplicable premonition. Andres took a hesitant step towards Apollo, who continued to lie calm, as if that moment was just another pause in his silent journey. The cub couldn't see the man, but he seemed to sense in the air. Apollo's body tensed, his ears moved slightly, capturing the sound of Andres's irregular breathing, and then, after a that seemed to last an eternity, Andres whispered, "It can't be." Camilla frowned, confused. "What it was?" she asked softly. Andres heard, his eyes teary, still fixed on Apollo, and then, with his voice low, almost an embarrassed whisper, he revealed the secret he carried in his soul. "Years ago, I had a dog. He was blind, much like him. I abandoned him." The words fell into thee with the weight of a guilty confession. The silence around seemed to absorb each syllable, transforming them an echo that reverberated among everyone there. Camilla felt a lump in her throat. Matteo, beside her, took a deep breath, absorbing shock of the revelation. Andres continued, his voice shaking. I didn't know how to deal. I was young, immature. I didn't want thee. He was a burden to me. I left him on a road alone. I don't know what I thought. I just wanted to get away from the silence that followed was louder than any scream could have been. Camilla looked at Apollo, and at that moment seemed to make sense. The scars, the blank stare, the resistance to trust, the fear of human touch. Everything was part of a story that was now in a painful circle. The dog Andres abandoned had somehow found its way back to him, not in anger, not to a debt, but to save what he loved most, his daughter. Andrew slowly knelt down next to Apollo, as if the weight of guilt was anchored in every. His knees touched the ground with a slight impact, but inside him, the fall felt much greater, as if was crumbling from within. His face, marked by the desperation he had felt when searching for his daughter, was now bathed in tears of a kind, not of fear but of shame, regret, and a gratitude that hurt more than any physical wound could. He took a deep trying to find a stability that no longer existed within him. The hands were shaking, not because of tiredness, but because of the fragility of someone who in a single instant was forced to confront the past that they had tried to bury. The right hand reached out slowly towards Apollo, but stopped in midair, frozen by doubt. Do I have the right to touch it? The thought crossed his like a blade. The blind dog, the same being he had discarded like a burden, was now in front of him. But not just in front of him. He was there like a silent hero, the savior of the most precious thing Andres had, his daughter. The irony of life hit cruel and at the same time redeeming. The animal he abandoned, thinking it was worthless, had become his family's guardian. Apollo, on the other hand, remained motionless. There was no fear in his body, no resentment, just a serenity that to come from a place humans can't access. He felt somehow the emotional weight of that moment, but not in the way Andres dogs don't hold grudges. They keep memories of affection, presence, smell, voice. And for Apollo, that man before him was of a distant past, irrelevant in the present. The man swallowed, tears now flowing freely, falling onto the dirt and grass, mixing with the dust and dry leaves. The voice finally came out, a hoarse, broken whisper. Forgive me. Too simple but loaded with the weight of years of regret. Words that for Andres would perhaps never be enough, but didn't need them. He never needed it. The forgiveness was already there, silent, because Apollo never withheld it. He never held a grudge, because grudge is a burden that an animal's pure heart does not know how to carry. For Apollo, what mattered was not the past. It wasn't the moment he left behind, hungry and scared on a forgotten road. What mattered was the now, the present, where he could do what was always his essence: love, protect, save. Even blind, he saw what really mattered, and chose to love, even when the world loved him back. Camilla, with teary eyes, knelt beside the two, her heart sinking for witnessing something that transcended words. Was more than a reunion between a man and a dog. It was the clash between past and present, between abandonment and rescue, between guilt and silence. She placed a gentle hand on Andres' shoulder, not to console him, but to remind him without words that he was forgiven. By her, but by Apollo himself, who never needed excuses to continue loving. Andrew cried, but it wasn't the kind of cry that easily, the kind that comes from fright or momentary sadness. It was a dense, heavy cry, rooted in a deep place in soul, where the oldest guilt and truths that we try to bury live. The tears fell hot, cutting across the face, as if they to engrave on the skin everything that the heart could no longer hold. He cried for what he did, yes, but most of he cried for what he did. Apollo had done for him. Not because Apollo had any obligation, a debt to pay, or any reason that linked him to dark past that Andres was trying to forget. Apollo owed nothing to anyone, and even so, he had saved the most thing Andres had in the world, his daughter. It was the kind of crying that only happens when the heart no longer finds space to what hurts. A mixture of regret and gratitude, of shame and love, confused, jumbled, impossible to separate. Andres sobbed softly, his body bent, his hands pressing his face, as if he wanted to hide from his own. He cried for having been too small in the past, for having looked at such a huge being and not seeing what he was. I cried because I hadn't realized that Apollo was never a burden, never a problem. Problem was always within him, in the fear of being responsible for a life that depended on him to exist. And now, years later, fate, with its silence, made him face the truth. The dog he abandoned had become greater than anything he could have been. Apollo. She remained there, next to the same way as always, silent, calm. The body was still, but the heart was beating, a presence that said more than any words could express. Didn't back down, he didn't judge. He didn't carry the shadow of hurt that humans tend to harbor. Because Apollo was made of other matter, something humans are slow to understand, or perhaps never fully understand. Even blind, he always saw what really matters. Love doesn't need eyes to see. He lives in simple gestures, in silent presences, in hearts that know how to feel more than analyze. Apollo never explanations, excuses, or promises. For him, what mattered was now. The present, where he could exist, love, and simply to be. Forgiveness there all along. Not as a gift to be bestowed, but as a natural state. Apollo didn't forgive because Andres deserved it. He forgave because never learned to hate. And this is the purest and most painful thing about the story. Apollo never needed to learn to forgive. He never held a grudge. Love, when it is true, not need words to be felt. It just happens. And it was in this silence that true forgiveness happened. There was no exact moment, a striking phrase or grand gesture. There was just presence. Andres broken by the past and Apollo whole despite everything. Two very different, linked by a story that began with abandonment, but ended with the rescue of something even more important than a life, redemption. Cried because deep down, he understood that Apollo had saved him twice. One when he found his lost daughter in the park, and another now when, saying anything without expecting anything in return, he showed that true love never disappears. It just waits for the right moment to be seen. Returned home with Camila and Mateo, but something had changed. It wasn't just home that looked different, it was Apollo himself. The same floor that had learned to recognize with his fragile paws, the same familiar smell of the walls, and the comforting sound of the voices he now has family. Everything was there, intact, but inside him, anew had been written, marked not by the pain of the past, but by the strength of what he had become. He was no longer the blind, abandoned dog who'd been rescued from a life of oblivion and suffering. He now carried within him a story that transcended abandonment, loneliness and fear itself. He was a hero, not the kind who wear capes or face epic battles, but the kind of silent hero whose actions speak more than 1,000 words could. The pain that Apollo had experienced did not define him, but it shaped every scar, every shaky step. Every painful memory turned into something greater than the suffering itself, a testament to your ability, love, to trust again, and most of all, to forward. He proved that love doesn't need perfection to exist. You don't need guarantees, promises, or conditions. True love, simply, and. Even in the Apollo found the way, and the most beautiful thing is that he never needed eyes to see. What he saw and what he teaches us to see is what physical vision can achieve. Because Apollo always saw with his heart. He saw the kindness in gestures, Mateo's silent patience, and in some inexplicable way, he felt the little girl's despair. Sophia, when no one else found her. The real miracle was not the girl's rescue, although that was extraordinary. The true miracle was the rescue of very essence. He proved that no matter how broken you are, how dark your path has been, you can still find outside, but within yourself. Camila and Mateo saw Apollo with different eyes now, not with pity, but with silent admiration. The of respect that comes from the realization that they were looking at an extraordinary soul. They understood that they hadn't just rescued a dog, had been rescued by him too, because Apollo, with his story of loss and reunion, taught something no words could explain, that love, true love, needs no explanations. In the end, Apollo didn't need eyes to see what really matters. Somehow he taught this to everyone who crossed his path. Stories like that of Apollo, they remind us of the silent power of love, and the strength exists in even the most hurting hearts. If this journey has you in some way, your reaction may inspire others too. Like the video, subscribe to follow even more exciting stories and comment to show that, like Apollo, you believe that even in the dark, love finds the way. And because the next video brings an even more surprising story that will change your life and move you in a way you never thought would happen.